Marjorie Traitor Brown, I call her, because green turns to brown under stress. So I call her Traitor Brown, which I don't like doing because 2 words is too much, 2 out of 3. We're changing to Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm going Marjorie Traitor Brown, so I have to trade. And a lot of people don't understand 2 words is too much to change. I actually like Marjorie Taylor Brown better, but everyone says Marjorie Traitor Greene is good, but they're all good. But what the hell happened to her? She must have been a stone cold liberal. She's on CNN now all the time. Can you believe it? And it was only because I couldn't call her back. You know, I have 218, 19 to change it, but we have 200 and some odd congressmen and women. I have 53 senators. I have 212 countries. I've got a family. I should talk to my family too.
So did you watch it? Did you actually witness what just unfolded before your very eyes? Because I promise you this is the kind of moment that historians will dissect for decades when they chronicle the collapse of American fascism from within. When they write about how authoritarian movements devour themselves with the same ravenous appetite they once directed at democracy itself. And here we are in December 2025, watching in real time as Donald Trump, the man who once enjoyed Marjorie Taylor Greene's unflinching loyalty, has now publicly humiliated her at a rally, calling her Marjorie Traitor Brown, and suggesting she was secretly a stone-cold liberal, a spectacle so bizarre and yet so perfectly emblematic of the authoritarian playbook that you almost have to laugh, except you cannot laugh because Greene has reported receiving death threats against her and her son, with subject lines using Trump's exact words, Marjorie Traitor Greene, and she stated that threats which once came from the left are now coming from the right, which tells you everything you need to understand about the mechanics of fascist terror and the way power consolidates itself through ritualized violence against anyone, literally anyone, who dares to step even 1 millimeter outside the ever-narrowing circle of absolute fealty. And listen, before we go any further, let me promise you, we are going to unpack the deepest implications of this fracture. We are going to explore why this represents not just political theater, but a genuine crisis point for the authoritarian right in America. We are going to talk about the Epstein files and what it means when even the most loyal MAGA warrior becomes expendable, and we are going to discuss how there is no unified MAGA front right now, despite what the propaganda wants you to believe, because what you just witnessed is the snake eating its own tail, and the question becomes whether this accelerates the authoritarian project, or whether it represents the beginning of a long-awaited fracture that those of us who care about democracy can actually exploit. Trump revived this feud by calling her Marjorie Traitor Brown, because Greene turns to brown under stress, claimed she must have been a stone-cold liberal, she's on CNN now all the time, and mocked her for complaining that he wouldn't return her calls, which on the surface reads like the deranged ramblings of a man who cannot distinguish between political disagreement and personal betrayal, but actually represents something far more sinister when you understand the authoritarian psychology at work here. This is a man who demands not just political alignment but emotional submission, who requires not just votes but worship, and who cannot tolerate the existence of independent thought, even from someone who spent years as one of his most prominent defenders in Congress. And that psychological structure, that need for total domination, is precisely what scholars of authoritarianism from Hannah Arendt to Timothy Snyder have identified as the hallmark of totalitarian movements that ultimately consume themselves. Now here is where this gets absolutely explosive, and I need you to stay with me because the layers here are staggering. Greene said Trump was extremely angry at her for signing a discharge petition to release the Jeffrey Epstein files, and she argued Trump was coming after her hard to make an example to scare other Republicans before a vote to release those files, which means we are not just talking about hurt, feelings or political disagreements about foreign policy priorities, but about Trump using his bully pulpit and his capacity to incite violence among his followers to silence someone who was demanding transparency about one of the most significant scandals involving powerful elites and sexual abuse in modern American history. Let that sink in for a moment because the implications are genuinely chilling, because what Greene is alleging, and what the timeline certainly supports, is that the United States is moving swiftly from liberal democracy toward authoritarianism according to hundreds of political scientists, with experts like Stephen Levitsky stating, "We've slid into some form of authoritarianism, and we are no longer living in a liberal democracy, that we are watching in real time how that authoritarian consolidation operates through the intimidation of even the most loyal supporters when they threaten to expose uncomfortable truths." And you know what makes this moment so theoretically rich, so pedagogically valuable for those of us who study the mechanics of democratic backsliding? It is that Greene herself is not some progressive hero. She is not some champion of justice who suddenly discovered her conscience. She is in fact someone who supported the election lies that fueled the January 6 attack on the Capitol, and became a media fixture as a promoter of Trump-style conservatism, someone who trafficked in conspiracy theories, and who used inflammatory rhetoric to build her political brand. And yet even she has now discovered that the machinery of authoritarian violence she helped construct can and will be turned against her the moment she deviates from the leader's preferences. This is the iron law of authoritarian movements that we see repeated throughout history, from the Jacobins devouring their own during the terror to Stalin's purges of old Bolsheviks. The revolution always ends up consuming its most fervent supporters, because the logic of absolute power cannot tolerate the existence of anyone with independent agency or moral claims that might compete with the leader's authority. Greene announced she would resign from Congress in January after her feud with Trump exploded when he withdrew his endorsement and support for her, and threatened to back a primary challenger against her. And think about the mechanism of control that represents. Think about how Trump has transformed the Republican Party into what political commentators describe as largely submissive to Trump, letting him dictate policies without pushback during his second presidency, such that the mere threat of a primary challenge backed by Trump is enough to end a political career even for someone as high-profile and as seemingly secure in her district as Greene. This is not normal politics. This is not the way democratic parties are supposed to function, with robust internal debate and tolerance for dissent. This is the logic of the cult of personality taken to its natural conclusion, where polling found that 53% of Republican voters see loyalty to Trump as central to their political identity and what it means to be a Republican, which means the party has ceased to be a vehicle for policy preferences or ideological commitments and has become instead a vehicle for the expression of personal loyalty to an authoritarian leader. But wait, because here is where this story takes an even more fascinating turn, and this is something I need you to really sit with because it complicates the narrative in ways that are genuinely instructive. Greene's voters don't appear to have repudiated her even though she's now a target of Trump's ire, showing political resilience in the face of Trump's vilification, with some Republicans commending her for standing up to the president. This is remarkable because it suggests that maybe, just maybe, there are limits to Trump's power even within his own coalition, that the authoritarian project is not as complete as it might appear from the outside, and that there exist pockets of resistance even among conservative voters who have been radicalized by Trumpism, but who retain some capacity for independent judgment. Now I want to be very careful here, not to overstate this, because these are still conservative voters in a deeply red district who overwhelmingly support Trump's agenda, but the fact that they are capable of saying I can like two people who don't like each other. One local Republican official put it for pick suggests that the MAGA movement is not monolithic, that it contains contradictions and fractures that might be exploited by those of us committed to democratic renewal. And speaking of fractures, let me take you deeper into what is happening within the broader MAGA coalition right now, because this Trump-Greene split is not occurring in isolation, but rather as part of what became visible at the first major Turning Point USA gathering since founder Charlie Kirk's murder, which instead of bringing right-wing activists together to celebrate Kirk's life, has laid bare the divisions of a fractious conservative coalition, increasingly worried about electoral prospects, with Kirk's widow noting, "When he was assassinated, we saw infighting, we've seen fractures, we've seen bridges being burned that shouldn't be burned." The movement is eating itself. The coalition that seemed so powerful and unified is revealing itself to be riven with internal contradictions about foreign policy and domestic priorities and the very nature of what conservatism means in the Trump era. And these are not superficial disagreements, but fundamental conflicts about the direction of the movement that cannot be papered over with appeals to unity. Now let me connect this to the broader authoritarian context, because what we are witnessing is not unique to America, but part of a global pattern that scholars of comparative politics have been documenting for decades. America is heading toward competitive authoritarian rule, according to experts, with the Trump administration having already begun to weaponize state institutions and deploy them against opponents, and U.S. democracy will likely break down during the second Trump administration, in the sense that it will cease to meet standard criteria for liberal democracy, which means we are living through a genuine regime transition, not in the direction of old-style dictatorship, with completely fraudulent elections, but toward what political scientists call competitive authoritarianism, where elections still occur, but the playing field is tilted so dramatically in favor of the ruling party that genuine alternation of power becomes nearly impossible. And what we know from studying competitive authoritarian regimes in places like Turkey and Hungary and Venezuela is that a leader comes to power democratically and then erodes the system of checks and balances by filling civil service and key appointments with loyalists and then attacking media, universities, and non-governmental organizations to blunt criticism and tilt the electoral playing field. And literally every single one of those tactics is being deployed by the Trump administration right now, as Trump has followed a checklist for consolidating power and silencing dissent, exerting unprecedented control over government bureaucracy, the military, internal security, the legal system, civil society, higher education, and the media. And here is where I need to drop an absolute bombshell of a connection that I promise will reframe everything you just watched in that clip. Because the Trump-Greene split is not just about personalities or hurt feelings, but about a fundamental tension within authoritarian movements between consolidation of personal power and the instrumental use of extremist forces. Greene represented during Trump's first term and the early part of his second term what scholars would call a useful extremist, someone whose willingness to traffic in conspiracy theories and inflammatory rhetoric helped normalize Trump's own authoritarian impulses and shift the Overton window of acceptable political discourse. But Greene has recently criticized Trump for claiming actor Rob Reiner and his wife were killed, calling Trump's comments absolutely completely below the office of the president, and told CNN that Trump is losing his influence over the Republican Party, noting the dam is breaking, which suggests she has begun to recognize that the authoritarian project has moved beyond instrumental extremism into something more dangerous and less controllable, and that recognition makes her a liability rather than an asset. Let me take you even deeper into the psychological dynamics here, because what Trump is doing to Greene is not accidental or impulsive, but represents a calculated performance of dominance that serves multiple strategic functions within the authoritarian playbook. By publicly humiliating someone who was once among his most loyal supporters, Trump sends a message to every other Republican officeholder that no amount of past loyalty will protect you if you step out of line, which is precisely how authoritarian leaders maintain discipline within their coalitions and prevent the emergence of alternative power centers. Greene said the most hurtful thing Trump said, which is absolutely untrue, is he called me a traitor, and that is so extremely wrong, and those are the types of words used that can radicalize people against me and put my life in danger. And she apologized humbly for taking part in toxic politics, saying she has thought about this a lot, which represents a remarkable moment of self-awareness from someone who spent years deploying exactly those tactics against others. And while I am not interested in absolving Greene of responsibility for the damage she has done, I am interested in the pedagogical value of watching someone recognize in real time how the machinery of authoritarian violence operates when it is turned against you personally. And you know what is so maddening? What should enrage every single person who cares about democratic accountability and the rule of law? The fact that the split between Trump and Greene has coincided with a slump in Trump's national popularity a year after his re-election, suggestions that he's becoming a lame duck, and an unprecedented revolt in which Greene played a leading role against Trump by the Capitol Hill GOP over the Jeffrey Epstein files, which tells us that substantive policy disputes and demands for transparency on issues of genuine public concern are being crushed through the deployment of what amounts to stochastic terrorism, the use of inflammatory rhetoric by a powerful leader to incite violence by followers without explicitly calling for it. This is how authoritarian regimes silence dissent in the modern era, not through official censorship or formal prosecution, though those tools are certainly used as well, but through the creation of an environment where anyone who speaks out knows they are putting themselves and their families at risk of violence from radicalized followers of the regime. Now I want to pull back and talk about the broader implications for progressive organizing and resistance, because it would be a mistake to simply watch this spectacle with satisfaction that the right is eating itself without understanding what it means for those of us committed to building a multiracial democracy rooted in justice. The fracturing of the Trump-Greene alliance has occurred in an explosive feud that could foreshadow more rifts within Trump's Make America Great Again movement before next year's midterm election, and the question becomes whether progressives can exploit these divisions, or whether we will simply watch as a more streamlined and more ruthlessly authoritarian version of Trumpism emerges from this intra-coalition warfare. The history of anti-fascist organizing teaches us that authoritarian movements are most vulnerable when their internal contradictions are exposed and when alternative visions of politics become visible to those who might otherwise accept authoritarian rule as inevitable. And that means we need to be actively reaching out to conservative voters who are disturbed by what they are seeing, not to compromise our values or water down our demands for justice, but to demonstrate that democratic politics offers a viable alternative to the circus of personality cults and performative cruelty. And let me be absolutely clear about something, because I know there will be people who say I am being too alarmist or too dramatic in my analysis, who will argue that American institutions are strong enough to withstand Trump's authoritarian impulse. Trump has already established a record of employing authoritarian tactics during his first term, and credible reporting has documented the ambitions Trump and his allies harbor of consolidating power to seek vengeance, but GOP lawmakers and elite political circles have declined to take the threat seriously, with the Wall Street Journal editorial board writing that American institutions are strong enough to contain whatever designs Trump has to abuse presidential power, and that complacency, that refusal to take the threat seriously, is precisely what enables authoritarian consolidation to proceed. We have seen this pattern repeated in every single case of democratic backsliding, from Weimar Germany to contemporary Hungary, where establishment figures convince themselves that the authoritarian leader is just engaging in rhetoric, that the institutions will hold, that things cannot really get that bad, and then they wake up one day to discover that the transformation is already complete. Listen to me very carefully, because this is perhaps the most important point I need to make about what we just witnessed in that clip, and what it means for the trajectory of American politics. Trump's election has exacerbated internal schisms within the GOP, moving it from a center coalition to a solidly right-wing party hostile to liberal views and any deviations from the party line, with intense factionalism apparent in the House, where 3 Republican leaders have been ousted since 2009, and the party's establishment conservative faction having lost all its influence, with no former Republican presidential or vice presidential nominees attending the 2024 Republican National Convention. This is not a normal political party experiencing routine factional disputes. This is a party that has been transformed into what political scientists would recognize as the political arm of an authoritarian movement, and the process of that transformation has been so rapid and so complete that anyone who remembers what the Republican Party was like even 15 years ago should be shocked by what it has become. And here is where we need to talk about the specific mechanisms through which Trump maintains control over this coalition, because it is not just charisma or force of personality, but a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit the affordances of modern media and modern political organizing. Greene noted that as a Republican who overwhelmingly votes for President Trump's bills and agenda, his aggression against me, which also fuels the venomous nature of his radical internet trolls, many of whom are paid, this is completely shocking to everyone, which points to the reality that Trump has built an infrastructure of harassment and intimidation that operates both formally through campaign organizations and informally through networks of online activists who can be mobilized against any target Trump designates. This is the 21st century version of what brown shirts provided for Hitler or what the black shirts provided for Mussolini. Not organized paramilitary units, though we have seen some of that too, with groups like the Proud Boys, but distributed networks of individuals who understand their role is to attack anyone the leader identifies as disloyal and who gain status within the movement through their willingness to engage in increasingly extreme harassment. Now let me take you into even more disturbing territory, and I say this with full recognition that what I am about to describe sounds almost too dark to be real. MAGA Republicans in mid-2024 were substantially more likely than non-MAGA non-Republicans to view political violence as justified and to endorse beliefs associated with violence, and while MAGA Republicans more frequently predicted they would be armed in a future setting where they considered political violence justified at nearly 20%, they were not more likely to shoot someone at around 2%, which tells us that we are dealing with a movement in which a significant minority is prepared to engage in political violence, and a larger group is psychologically prepared to accept violence as a legitimate political tactic. This is not normal. This is not the way democratic politics is supposed to function, and the fact that we have normalized this level of violent rhetoric in preparation for violence should terrify anyone who understands how authoritarian takeovers actually proceed. And you want to know what keeps me up at night? What should keep all of us up at night as we watch this spectacle unfold? It is the recognition that it was never realistic that a lone member of Congress would prevail in a political test of wills, with a president who transformed the GOP in his image and enjoys an exceptional bond with party grassroots. But Greene argues that the president has departed from the values that took him into office, which is a threat to Trump's authority, at a difficult political moment, when the power of second-term presidents often starts to ebb, and that means we are in an incredibly volatile situation, where Trump feels threatened, where his authority is being questioned, and where he has every incentive to escalate his authoritarian tactics to reassert dominance. Authoritarian leaders are most dangerous when they feel their power slipping, because that is when they are most likely to take desperate measures to crush opposition and consolidate control. And what we are watching right now is Trump attempting to make an example of Greene to prevent any other Republicans from stepping out of line. Let me bring this full circle by returning to the clip itself and unpacking what was so revealing about Trump's specific language, because the rambling stream of consciousness quality of his attack on Greene is not evidence of cognitive decline or incoherence, but rather a deliberate rhetorical strategy that serves multiple functions. When Trump cycles through different versions of the nickname, when he explains his reasoning about Greene turns to Brown under stress, when he complains about how many people he has to talk to and how he cannot return all his calls, he is performing a specific kind of authoritarian theater that demonstrates his power through its very casualness, that shows he can destroy someone's career almost as an afterthought, while thinking out loud about naming conventions. This is what Hannah Arendt identified as the banality of evil in her analysis of totalitarianism, the way that authoritarian violence and domination become routinized and casual, stripped of any sense of moral weight or consequence, and transformed into just another aspect of day-to-day political performance. And we absolutely cannot ignore the gender dynamics of this particular attack, because Trump mocked Greene for complaining that he doesn't call her back, saying you can't call a president every single day, and when the president doesn't call you back, she goes around saying he doesn't call me back, which frames Greene's legitimate policy concerns and demands for accountability as feminine emotional neediness, as irrational attachment, as the behavior of a spurned woman rather than a member of Congress engaging in constitutionally appropriate oversight. This is classic misogynist rhetoric that delegitimizes women's political participation by framing it as emotional rather than rational, as personal rather than principled, and it is particularly insidious because it activates deep cultural scripts about women's supposed emotional instability that make it harder for female politicians to be taken seriously when they raise substantive concerns. Greene said she will stop using toxic rhetoric in what would be a dramatic shift in her political brand, with the commitment coming amid her rift with Trump, and she apologized humbly for taking part in toxic politics, saying, "I'm only responsible for myself and my own words and actions, and I've been working on this a lot lately to put down the knives in politics," calling on people to come together and end toxic, dangerous rhetoric, saying, "I'm leading the way with my own example, and I hope that President Trump can do the same." And listen, I am deeply skeptical about the sincerity of this conversion, given Greene's long history of inflammatory rhetoric and conspiracy mongering, but I am also interested in what it signals about the political moment we are in. The fact that Greene feels the need to position herself as someone calling for de-escalation and civility, even if that positioning is purely strategic, suggests she recognizes that the political environment Trump has created is becoming unsustainable, that the level of violence and intimidation has reached a point where even someone who benefited from that environment for years can see it might consume her. Now let me take us to the absolute core theoretical insight we need to extract from this moment, because this is not just about Trump and Greene, this is not just about Republican Party infighting, this is about the fundamental dynamics of how authoritarian movements consolidate power and ultimately fail. What we are witnessing is the inevitable tension between the personal loyalty demanded by authoritarian leaders and the institutional requirements of actually governing, between the need to maintain a coalition broad enough to win elections and the impulse to purge anyone who shows independent judgment, between the short-term benefits of intimidation and violence and the long-term unsustainability of a political movement based entirely on fear. Republicans have been consumed by infighting over the party's future, with opposing factions in open disagreement about how to deal with the rising tide of extremism on the right that grew out of Trump's presidency, and these are not contradictions that can be resolved through better leadership or more effective communication, but are inherent to the authoritarian project itself. And you know what gives me hope, what makes me believe that we can still pull back from the authoritarian precipice, even as late in the game as we are? It is moments like this when the contradictions become so visible, when the cruelty and the violence and the casual destruction of people's lives become so undeniable, that even some of those who participated in building the authoritarian machine start to recognize what they have created. I am not naive enough to think that Marjorie Taylor Greene has suddenly become a champion of democracy, or that her awakening to the dangers of toxic rhetoric makes up for years of promoting conspiracy theories and attacking vulnerable people, but I am strategic enough to recognize that every crack in the authoritarian coalition creates opportunities for democratic organizing. Every person who steps away from the movement becomes a potential voice for why others should do the same. Greene's rebellion is not the only force tearing at GOP unity, with a raging controversy over white nationalist Nick Fuentes dragging in the Heritage Foundation, and growing criticism of Trump from podcasters popular with young white men who played an important role in his 2024 election triumphs. which means the MAGA coalition is fraying across multiple dimensions simultaneously. And while each of these individual fractures might be containable, the cumulative effect of multiple sources of tension and conflict could prove impossible for Trump to manage. This is how authoritarian regimes ultimately fall, not usually through dramatic revolutionary moments, but through the gradual erosion of the coalition that sustains them, through the accumulation of small defections and the exposure of contradictions that the regime cannot resolve. So what does all of this mean for those of us committed to fighting for democracy and justice in this perilous moment? It means we need to be simultaneously realistic about the threat we face, clear-eyed about the fact that the second Trump administration may violate basic civil liberties in ways that unambiguously subvert democracy, while also being alert to the opportunities that emerge when authoritarian coalitions begin to fracture. It means we need to be building alternative institutions and networks of solidarity that can sustain resistance over the long term, because this fight is not going to be resolved in a single election cycle. It means we need to be reaching out to people who are beginning to question their participation in the MAGA movement, not to absolve them of responsibility for the damage they have done, but to create pathways for them to exit the movement and contribute to building something better. And it means we need to be absolutely uncompromising in our demands for accountability, for transparency, for the protection of civil liberties and democratic institutions, because the authoritarian project advances through the gradual normalization of abuses that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. What you just witnessed in that clip is not entertainment. It is not just bizarre political theater to be mocked and forgotten. It is a window into the internal dynamics of an authoritarian movement, at a critical juncture, where it might consolidate its power into something genuinely totalitarian, or where it might begin to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. And the outcome of that struggle is not predetermined. It will be determined by the choices that millions of people make over the coming months and years, by whether we can build a broad enough coalition to defend democracy, by whether we can articulate a vision of politics that offers something more than the nihilistic cruelty and personality worship of Trumpism. The stakes could not be higher, the moment could not be more urgent, and watching Trump destroy one of his most loyal supporters for the crime of demanding transparency about Jeffrey Epstein's crimes should clarify for anyone still harboring doubts exactly what kind of movement we are dealing with and what it will take to defeat it. This is the test of our generation. This is the moment when we discover whether American democracy is resilient enough to withstand authoritarian assault, or whether we will join the long list of democracies throughout history that failed when their citizens could not summon the courage and the solidarity necessary to defend them. And while I cannot promise you that we will win this fight, while I cannot guarantee that the cracks we are seeing in the MAGA coalition will be enough to bring down the authoritarian project, I can promise you that every single person who speaks out, who organizes, who refuses to be intimidated or silenced, makes victory more possible. So watch that clip again. Really watch it. See the casual cruelty and the authoritarian logic and the fracturing coalition, and then ask yourself what role you are going to play in the struggle that will determine whether we have a future worth living in.